Sometime in the mid-1950s, if you drove north out of downtown Detroit on Woodward Avenue on a warm Saturday afternoon, you were driving through what a lot of people genuinely believed was the most dynamic commercial corridor in the entire United States. Not just Michigan, the entire country. You would have passed the flagship J.L. Hudson's department store, which was at that point one of the tallest department stores on the planet, a building so enormous and so relentlessly busy that it employed 10,000 people and required its own internal telephone switchboard just to function as a single retail operation. You would have passed movie palaces with marquees that stretched halfway across the sidewalk, advertising first-run films to audiences who dressed up to go see them, the way people dressed up for church. You would have passed furniture showrooms, jewelers, haberdashers, five and dimes, restaurants packed at noon with factory workers and office secretaries and department store buyers, all rubbing elbows in a city that was producing more wealth per capita than almost anywhere else in the industrialized world. The sidewalks were so crowded on a weekend that you actually had to navigate through people the way you navigate through a busy airport terminal today, shoulder to shoulder, everybody moving, everybody spending, the whole street humming with a kind of productive commercial energy that felt, to the people inside it, like it could just go on forever. That was Woodward Avenue at its absolute peak, the spine of a city that was then genuinely among the most important on Earth, a place where the entire global automotive industry had been born and headquartered and was then still being run, a place that had helped win a world war by converting its factories almost overnight to war production, a place whose tax base, whose cultural institutions, whose sheer economic muscle made it a peer of Chicago and New York in ways that would become very hard to explain to anyone born after 1970. And today, if you make that same drive north out of downtown Detroit on Woodward Avenue, you will see something that no American city in living memory has produced quite so starkly, or on quite so large a scale, as what exists here. You will see block after block after block of abandoned buildings. Not occasional vacant storefronts between operating businesses, not a rough neighborhood with some empty lots mixed in among functioning ones, but sustained, consecutive, systematic abandonment at a density that has no real parallel on any comparably historic commercial street in America. Empty banks with their marble lobbies still mostly intact behind boarded windows. Apartment buildings with their facades crumbling while their structural bones still stand. Former showrooms and theaters and hotels sitting completely vacant, not for a year or two while somebody waits to redevelop them, but for decades, in some cases approaching half a century, slowly being reclaimed in their own way by weather and pigeons and the particular kind of silence that only exists inside a building that was once very loud and is now very quiet. If you want to understand how that happened, how the most powerful commercial street in one of the most powerful cities in the history of American manufacturing became a corridor that researchers and urban planners have studied as a kind of extreme case study in concentrated urban abandonment, then subscribe right now and settle in, because this story is longer and stranger and more instructive than almost anything else in American urban history, and almost nobody outside Detroit has actually worked through all of it. Let's start at the beginning. To understand what happened to Woodward Avenue, you first have to understand what Woodward Avenue actually was, which means understanding what Detroit actually was, which means going back further than most people's mental model of this city typically goes. Back past the decline, past the riots, past the white flight, all the way back to the particular economic foundation that made Detroit uniquely capable of rising as fast as it did, and that, it turned out, made it uniquely vulnerable to falling just as fast when the conditions that had built it started to change. Detroit was founded by the French in 1701 as a strategic military and trading post on the Detroit River, the narrow strait connecting Lake Erie to Lake Huron, a location that gave whoever controlled it significant leverage over Great Lakes fur trade, and later over the waterborne commerce, connecting the industrial Midwest to the Atlantic seaboard. It grew through the 19th century as a moderately successful industrial and commercial city, producing things like railroad cars and marine engines and cast iron stoves, the kind of mixed industrial manufacturing that characterized a lot of upper Midwest cities in that era. It was a real city, a legitimate city, but not yet a world historical city. That part came later, and it came specifically because of the peculiar geographical, economic, and entrepreneurial accident of the early automobile industry, clustering itself in southeastern Michigan. The reasons Detroit became the center of the automobile industry rather than, say, Chicago or Cleveland or Indianapolis involve a specific combination of factors that historians have argued about for decades. The availability of a skilled workforce of machinists and mechanics, trained in the existing marine engine and stove industries, proximity to the iron and steel production of the Great Lakes region, the presence of just enough capital in the local business community to fund early automotive ventures, and frankly a fair amount of luck in the form of which particular entrepreneurs happened to be located here when the technology was ready to be commercialized. Henry Ford was from Dearborn, just outside the city. Ransom Olds was in Lansing but did his early development work in Detroit. The Dodge brothers were here. David Buick was here. A sufficient critical mass of automotive ambition and mechanical talent converged in southeastern Michigan in the first decade of the 20th century in a way that became self-reinforcing almost immediately. Because once Ford and General Motors and Chrysler established themselves here, the entire supplier ecosystem, the companies making glass and rubber and steel stampings and upholstery and everything else that goes into a car, had every incentive to locate near their primary customers. And once the supplier ecosystem concentrated here, it became even harder for any new automotive venture to locate anywhere else, because all the talent and infrastructure and supply chains were already here. The result, by the 1920s and into the 1930s, was a city whose economic base was almost entirely dependent on one industry, in a way that no other major American city quite was, and that industry happened to be the single most dynamic, fastest-growing, most transformative industry of the entire 20th century. For roughly 3 decades, from about 1910 through the end of World War II, being the city where American cars were made was the equivalent of being the city where American internet companies were based 60 years later, with the exception that the car industry employed hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers at wages that made genuine middle-class life possible for people who had grown up in genuine poverty, which Silicon Valley's tech industry has never quite managed to replicate in the same way. The wealth that poured through Detroit during those decades was staggering in scale, and it concentrated itself along a particular corridor with particular intensity, Woodward Avenue, the long straight street that runs from downtown all the way north through the suburbs, which Judge Augustus Woodward had laid out as the central organizing axis of his 1807 plan for a rebuilt Detroit after the original city burned down that same year. It was Judge Woodward who gave the street its name, though he was actually planning it as a kind of Champs-Élysées for the New World, a grand diagonal boulevard modeled on his admiration for the radial street plans of European capitals, which is why Woodward cuts through Detroit's otherwise grid-based street plan at the particular angle it does, an angle that over time became the spine of the entire metropolitan region. By the interwar period, Woodward had become the street in Detroit, not just for shopping, though it was certainly that, not just for theaters. Though the stretch from downtown through Midtown had accumulated a remarkable density of them, the Fox Theater, the Fillmore, the Palms, the Madison, the Fisher, an almost unbroken parade of entertainment palaces that made this mile or two of Woodward one of the most concentrated theater districts outside of Manhattan. Woodward was also where you went to see cars. The automobile showrooms that lined certain stretches of the avenue were themselves architectural statements, glass-fronted showrooms built to display the new model year vehicles in as glamorous a setting as possible, because Detroit's car companies understood, even in those early decades, that buying a car was as much an emotional and aspirational purchase as a practical one, and they wanted their showrooms to feel like the temples of modernity that their products were supposed to represent. For decades, people came from all over the city and all over the region specifically to drive or walk down Woodward and look at the new cars in the showroom windows, the way people in other cities went window shopping for clothes or furniture, which is a genuinely remarkable cultural fact if you sit with it for a moment, because it tells you just how completely the automobile was not just an industry in Detroit, but an identity, a way of understanding what this city was for and why it mattered. The peak of Woodward Avenue's commercial density and cultural vitality probably came in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, right in the immediate post-war decade when returning veterans and a booming domestic economy and the pent-up consumer demand of 15 years of depression and wartime rationing all collided with a city that was producing more cars than ever and generating more wealth than ever, and seemed, to everyone inside it, to be essentially in a permanent state of ascending greatness. The Hudson's department store expansion, the growth of the Paradise Valley Jazz District just east of Woodward, where black performers who couldn't play the segregated white venues on the avenue itself built one of the great American music scenes of the mid-century, producing artists and sounds that would eventually reshape global popular music. The Woodward Avenue Dream Cruise tradition, which started much later but was rooted in the very real 1950s and early 1960s culture of teenagers driving up and down Woodward on Friday and Saturday nights in their souped-up cars, cruising the avenue in a ritual that was simultaneously about the cars themselves, about the freedom of American adolescence in the post-war era, about the particular geography of a city built around automotive culture in a way that no other city quite was. All of that was real. All of that was happening simultaneously. And underneath all of it, hidden for a while by the sheer force of the boom, were the structural conditions that were already quietly arranging the city's eventual catastrophic decline. Let's talk about those conditions, because this is really the heart of everything that happened afterward, to Woodward Avenue, to Detroit's neighborhoods, to the whole metropolitan region. And if you don't understand these underlying dynamics, the physical decay you see on Woodward today is just depressing scenery without meaning. And the meaning is actually the important part. The first and most foundational structural problem was one that Detroit shared with a handful of other, intensely industrialized American cities, but experienced more extremely than almost any of them: radical economic monoculture. Detroit's entire economic ecosystem, its tax base, its employment base, the wealth of its residents, the revenue of its businesses, the solvency of its government, was tied to one industry with an intimacy and a completeness that made the city almost uniquely vulnerable to any disruption in that industry's fortunes. This wasn't a hidden or controversial observation. Economists and urban planners were pointing it out as a vulnerability as early as the 1930s. But when an industry is generating the kind of wealth and employment that the auto industry was generating for Detroit at its peak, it's very hard to convince anyone, workers, civic leaders, business owners, local politicians, that they should be doing anything other than doubling down on the thing that's obviously working, rather than hedging against hypothetical future problems that don't feel real yet. The second structural problem was racial segregation, and this one is harder to talk about briefly without oversimplifying it, but it is absolutely essential to understanding what happened to Woodward Avenue and to Detroit more broadly, because the particular way that Detroit's growth and decline were shaped by race is inseparable from the physical outcome you're looking at on that street today. Detroit, like most northern industrial cities, attracted enormous waves of black migration from the South during the First and Second World Wars, as black workers came north, seeking the industrial wages that were largely denied to them in the Jim Crow South. Detroit's auto plants, and Ford's in particular, employed black workers at higher rates and wages than almost any other major industrial employer in America during those decades, which made Detroit a genuine beacon of economic opportunity for black Southerners, in a way that cities like Chicago and Cleveland and Pittsburgh were too. But Detroit's auto wages were particularly good relative to the cost of living at the time. But that economic opportunity existed inside a city, and a metropolitan region, that was simultaneously building an almost perfectly structured system of residential racial segregation, enforced through restrictive housing covenants that legally barred black homeowners from purchasing property in most Detroit neighborhoods, through Federal Housing Administration lending policies that systematically redlined black neighborhoods and denied mortgages to black homebuyers purchasing in or near those neighborhoods, through real estate industry practices that steered black buyers into specific areas and white buyers away from any area with black residents, and through explicit violence against black families who attempted to purchase homes in white neighborhoods, a form of racial terror that was documented dozens of times in Detroit through the 1940s and 1950s, but that rarely resulted in serious legal consequences for the perpetrators. What this produced was a city in which a very large and economically significant black population was systematically compressed into a relatively small geographic area on the Near East Side of Detroit, including the Hastings Street corridor that was the heart of the Paradise Valley Entertainment District, while white Detroiters expanded freely into the outer neighborhoods of the city and, increasingly, into the surrounding suburbs of Oakland County and Macomb County and Wayne County outside the city limits. This compression created enormously overcrowded conditions in Black Detroit, with families paying premium prices for substandard housing in neighborhoods where landlord disinvestment was rational, precisely because the captive nature of the market meant tenants had nowhere else to go. It also created, for white Detroit and for Woodward Avenue specifically, a dynamic that would turn catastrophic in the second half of the 20th century. The moment that any of the structural barriers to black residential mobility even slightly loosened, the pent-up demand for more and better housing among Detroit's black population, combined with the enormous anxiety that white Detroiters had been systematically cultivated to feel about racial integration, produced a pace and scale of residential turnover, white flight, that no other major American city quite experienced with the same speed or totality. The third structural problem was the freeway, and this is the one that gets talked about most often in urban planning circles as a proximate cause of Woodward Avenue's decline, because it's the most visually obvious and in some ways the most direct, though it cannot be separated from the racial and economic dynamics that preceded and surrounded it. Beginning in the 1940s and accelerating dramatically through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Detroit built an extensive system of urban freeways that cut through the city's existing neighborhoods with a ruthlessness that was, in retrospect, almost deliberately destructive, though the people designing and building them would have described their work as modern, necessary, and progressive. The Lodge Freeway, the Chrysler Freeway, the Ford Freeway, the Jeffries Freeway, these roads, following the Federal Interstate Highway Program and the visions of planners who had decided that the future of urban transportation was the automobile rather than transit, were physically constructed through the densest, most established urban neighborhoods in the city, bulldozing tens of thousands of homes and apartments and businesses, and in many cases because of the racial geography of where the planning decisions chose to route the roads, displacing disproportionate numbers of black residents from established communities. The I-375 spur, for example, was built directly through the Hastings Street corridor, the heart of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, essentially erasing an entire urban neighborhood that had housed the cultural and commercial center of Black Detroit for decades, scattering its residents, destroying its business ecosystem, and leaving in its place a freeway and a string of housing projects that would themselves eventually be demolished. But the freeways didn't just destroy neighborhoods directly through their physical construction. They also did something subtler and in the long run more damaging, which was to make it dramatically easier for middle-class Detroit residents, white and eventually black, to live in the surrounding suburbs and commute into the city for work, or to live in the suburbs and do everything: work, shop, go to movies, go to church, socialize, entirely within the suburban geography without needing to come into the city at all. This was the mechanism of suburbanization, and Detroit was uniquely set up to experience it as severely as possible, for two reasons. First, Detroit's core industry, the automobile, was also the vehicle, literally, of suburbanization, which meant that Detroit's workers and residents were among the best equipped in America to exercise the suburban option, because nearly all of them had cars, and most of them had relatively good incomes, and the freeway system was being built specifically to connect suburban living to urban employment. Second, Detroit's city-suburban relationship was uniquely adversarial and racially charged in ways that made the suburban pull even stronger for white Detroiters than it was in comparable cities. The cities that managed suburbanization best tended to be ones where the political and tax boundaries were structured in ways that allowed the city to annex growing suburban areas, incorporating new growth into the city's tax base, rather than watching it leave for independent suburban municipalities. Detroit could not do this. Michigan's township and municipal incorporation laws, and specifically the resistance of the surrounding suburbs, made it essentially impossible for Detroit to annex the booming suburban communities of Oakland County and Macomb County, which meant that every white family that left Detroit for Grosse Pointe or Dearborn or Warren or Birmingham was not just a tax dollar lost, they were a tax dollar lost permanently to a neighboring municipality that would use its own growing tax base to build excellent schools and services that would in turn attract more families away from Detroit. Now take those three structural problems: economic monoculture in an industry that was about to face serious trouble, racial geography that made white flight particularly explosive, and freeway-enabled suburbanization that was siphoning the tax base out of the city faster than it could be replaced, and add to them the specific event that most people use as the dividing line in Detroit's history. The 1967 rebellion, or riot, depending on which term you use and what it means to you, which was a 5-day outbreak of civil unrest triggered by a police raid on an after-hours bar in a predominantly black neighborhood on the near west side that resulted in 43 deaths, more than 1,000 injuries, over 7,000 arrests, and the destruction of a substantial part of the city's commercial infrastructure through fire and looting. The federal government sent in the 82nd Airborne Division. National Guard units patrolled Detroit's streets for days. The physical damage, with 2,000 buildings burned and hundreds of businesses destroyed, was concentrated largely but not exclusively in the black neighborhoods of Detroit's Near East and Near West sides, and it left scars, literal physical scars, in the form of empty lots and burned-out buildings that in many cases persisted for decades. What the 1967 rebellion did, in terms of Woodward Avenue's trajectory, was to accelerate and intensify dynamics that had already been building for 15 years, by providing what enormous numbers of white Detroiters, fairly or not, used as the final psychological permission slip to leave the city permanently. White flight from Detroit had already been underway since the late 1940s, but the pace had been, until 1967, at least partially offset by a city that was still generating enough economic activity and civic energy to retain some middle-class residents and businesses. After 1967, the pace of departure became a rout. Major retailers, including Hudson's itself, began making plans for the suburban branch stores that would eventually lead them to abandon their flagship Woodward locations altogether. Businesses that had survived the economic and demographic pressures of the previous 2 decades made the calculation that the risk-reward profile of operating in Detroit had permanently changed. And critically, the insurance industry, in what was a genuinely significant and underappreciated driver of Detroit's physical decline, began redlining Detroit properties in ways that made it nearly impossible for building owners to get affordable coverage, which made building maintenance financially irrational, which accelerated disinvestment, which accelerated physical deterioration, which accelerated the sense that Detroit was in a spiral it could not reverse. All of this was happening not in isolation, but in the context of the broader national urban crisis of the late 1960s, a moment when cities across America were losing population and tax base to the suburbs, when federal urban policy was shifting in ways that reduced the resources available to struggling cities, and when the combination of deindustrialization, racial tension, and suburban competition was creating fiscal pressure on urban governments that many of them were simply not structured to survive intact. Detroit's automotive industry, the foundation of everything, was also beginning its long structural decline in this exact same period, though the full severity of that decline wouldn't become undeniable for another decade or so. The 1970s oil shocks, triggered by the 1973 OPEC embargo and then the 1979 Iranian Revolution, exposed a structural vulnerability in Detroit's automotive strategy that had been invisible during the long post-war era of cheap gasoline. American consumers, confronted suddenly with expensive gasoline and long lines at filling stations, turned towards smaller, more fuel-efficient cars in enormous numbers, and the cars they wanted were not the large, powerful, fuel-hungry vehicles that Detroit's Big Three had built their entire post-war profitability around. Japanese automakers, particularly Toyota and Honda and Nissan, had spent the previous 2 decades building manufacturing expertise in exactly the smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicle segment that American automakers had mostly neglected. And when American consumers went looking for that product, they found it, and they bought it, and they kept buying it even after the immediate oil price crisis passed, because they discovered that the Japanese vehicles were also, in many cases, more reliable and better quality than what Detroit was producing at competitive price points. The loss of American automotive market share to Japanese competition through the 1970s and 1980s was a slow-motion economic disaster for Detroit, not in the sense of a sudden collapse, but in the sense of a grinding, decade-long contraction of employment and wages in the one industry that had structured the entire local economy. Plant closures, layoffs measured in the tens of thousands, supplier bankruptcies radiating outward through the entire regional economy as the primary producers contracted. The loss of good-paying blue-collar manufacturing jobs, at the scale that Detroit experienced them, was not just an economic statistic. It was an existential transformation of the city's residential and commercial geography. Because those jobs had been the mechanism by which working-class and lower-middle-class Detroit families could afford mortgages, could afford to patronize neighborhood businesses, could afford to pay property taxes that funded city services, could participate in the commercial life of Woodward Avenue and the dozens of neighborhood commercial corridors that radiated out from it. When those jobs disappeared, or when they paid substantially less than they had before, or when they moved to suburban or exurban plant locations that required car commutes from suburban addresses rather than being accessible by transit from city neighborhoods, The economic foundation of the city's remaining residential neighborhoods eroded in ways that were direct and physical and visible. Businesses that depended on local foot traffic and local spending couldn't stay open, and buildings that lost their commercial tenants often couldn't find new ones because the economic conditions that had justified their construction and operation no longer existed. The federal government's role in all of this is worth pausing on, because it is genuinely enormous and genuinely underappreciated in most popular accounts of Detroit's decline, which tend to focus on the 1967 riot, or on white flight, or on automotive competition, as if these were self-contained explanations rather than components of a larger system. Federal housing policy, from the New Deal through the post-war era, had actively subsidized suburban homeownership for white Americans through FHA mortgage guarantees and VA home loans that were systematically denied to black applicants or structured in ways that excluded black neighborhoods from eligibility, which meant that the American federal government was, through its own lending programs, actively financing the suburban departure that drained Detroit of its middle-class white population and tax base. Federal highway funding, through the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, provided the infrastructure for that suburban departure, subsidizing the road construction that made suburban commuting viable while doing virtually nothing to maintain or improve the urban transit systems that the people who stayed in Detroit, disproportionately older, poorer, and black, depended on to get around. And federal urban renewal funding, which was supposed to help cities modernize and rebuild their housing stock, became in many cases a tool for the demolition of existing working-class and black urban neighborhoods, without adequate replacement of the housing that was destroyed, contributing to the physical hollowing out of urban residential fabric in ways that, in Detroit as in many other cities, produced more blight than it resolved. The combination of all these forces, racial geography and white flight, deindustrialization, suburban competition and the loss of the tax base, federal policy failures, the psychological disruption of 1967, the slow death of the retail and entertainment institutions that had anchored Woodward Avenue as a commercial destination, produced by the 1980s and 1990s, a physical landscape on Woodward Avenue that was genuinely unlike anything else in America at comparable scale. Buildings didn't just empty on Woodward. They emptied, and then they stayed empty, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, because the conditions that would normally drive redevelopment, population growth or stability, a commercial demand for space, investment capital willing to bet on the area's future, functioning city services, making the neighborhood safe and attractive for new businesses, weren't present. The city of Detroit, losing population every decade from its peak of 1.8 million in 1950 all the way down to under 700,000 today, a loss of more than 60% of its peak population, simply did not generate the market demand that makes private redevelopment pencil out in most circumstances. And the city government, whose revenue base shrank alongside its population, while its service obligations and its legacy costs for pensions and debt service remained stubbornly high, lacked the fiscal capacity to either maintain existing infrastructure at adequate levels or to offer the kind of subsidies and incentives that might have attracted private investment in their absence. What made Woodward Avenue specifically the worst case for building abandonment rather than some other Detroit street has to do with a combination of its particular commercial history, its scale, and the specific way its buildings were constructed in the era of its greatest development. Woodward's commercial strip was built out primarily during the boom decades of the early and mid-20th century, which means it is lined with large, substantially built commercial structures, banks, department stores, theater palaces, auto showrooms, hotel buildings that were designed and constructed to last for a century or more. These are not cheap, quickly built strip mall structures that are easy to demolish or easy to repurpose. They are heavy, ornate, masonry-constructed buildings with deep basements, elaborate facades, and floor plates and structural systems that were designed for the commercial uses of their era, but that are often difficult and expensive to adapt to modern uses without substantial renovation investment. The cost of rehabilitating a vacant 1920s bank building on Woodward Avenue into a functioning modern use, accounting for asbestos abatement, bringing electrical and plumbing systems up to modern code, addressing decades of deferred maintenance and weather infiltration damage, is often staggering relative to the market value of the finished product in a city where real estate values have been chronically depressed by the overall conditions of population loss and disinvestment. This creates a situation that urban economists call the gap problem. The cost of renovation exceeds what the finished renovation is worth on the open market, which means private developers can't make the economics work without public subsidy, and the public sector in Detroit has had very limited capacity to provide that subsidy for most of the past several decades, which means buildings sit and sit and sit, deteriorating further with each passing year, and each winter freeze and each summer rainstorm, making the eventual cost of rehabilitation even higher, deepening the gap further, and ensuring that the building stands empty for another decade. The specific block-by-block statistics on Woodward Avenue's abandonment rate are striking enough that they deserve to be stated clearly and directly. Studies of the corridor have found that in the stretches of Woodward running from downtown Detroit north through the New Center area and into the inner ring suburbs, abandonment rates per block have at various points measured among the highest recorded for any historically significant commercial street in the United States. Not nationally significant in the way of minor regional main streets in economically troubled small towns, but a major urban boulevard that was once comparable in commercial vitality to State Street in Chicago or Peachtree Street in Atlanta, sitting with vacancy rates that would be considered catastrophic by any standard for any street in any city. Entire blocks, where every building save one or two is vacant. Stretches where the empty buildings outnumber the occupied ones, 3 or 4 to 1. Former theater palaces that seated thousands of people every night in 1955 that have sat completely empty, with their interiors decaying behind locked doors and boarded windows, for 30 or 40 years. Auto showrooms that once displayed the latest Oldsmobiles and Buicks to thousands of weekend visitors that now sit dark and dusty with their showroom glass intact, but nothing behind it. It is not unusual, driving certain stretches of Woodward today, to pass 5 or 6 consecutive buildings in complete vacancy before finding a single occupied storefront. The J.L. Hudson's building itself, arguably the single most important commercial landmark in the history of Woodward Avenue, is now gone, demolished in 1998 after years of failed redevelopment attempts, in a controlled implosion that drew a crowd of tens of thousands of Detroiters who came to watch one of the city's most iconic structures come down. The demolition was broadcast on television. People cried, and for a long time after that, the enormous lot where Hudson's had stood sat completely empty in the heart of downtown Detroit, an absence so large and so conspicuous that it became a kind of symbol of the city's predicament, the biggest wound visible from the street. There is now a new mixed-use development project on that site, the Hudson's Detroit Project, part of the broader downtown revival that has been genuinely occurring in certain parts of the city over the last decade, though whether it signals a durable turnaround or a narrow island of reinvestment surrounded by continued disinvestment in the rest of the city is something that urban economists and Detroiters themselves still debate honestly and energetically. Because here's the thing that's important to understand about Detroit's situation that gets lost in both the doom narrative and the comeback narrative. Neither of those narratives is fully accurate, and the gap between them is where most of the complexity and most of the real story actually lives. Detroit has experienced a genuine, measurable, significant downtown and midtown revival over the roughly 15 years since the mid-2000s. The area around Woodward, from the downtown core through Midtown near Wayne State University and the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Henry Ford Hospital complex, has seen real investment, real new businesses, real population growth, real street activity of the kind that was genuinely missing for decades. Dan Gilbert, the founder of Quicken Loans, has purchased and rehabilitated dozens of downtown Detroit buildings, making a bet on the city's commercial real estate with a scale and visibility that has materially changed the ground-level experience of downtown. The Midtown area around Wayne State has developed a genuine neighborhood commercial ecosystem of restaurants, coffee shops, small retail, and cultural venues that has attracted young residents in numbers the area hasn't seen in decades. The Detroit Institute of Arts, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the Fox Theater, which was itself a landmark restoration story back in the 1980s when Mike Ilitch purchased and meticulously restored it at great expense, all continue operating as genuine cultural anchors that draw audiences from across the metropolitan region. But the revival, however real it is in those specific zones, has not spread evenly or quickly along Woodward Avenue's full length, and the stretches of the avenue north of the Midtown zone, through North End and into neighborhoods like Piety Hill and the University District and beyond, into Highland Park and Hamtramck, remain dramatically emptier and more distressed than the downtown adjacent areas that have received the most attention and investment. The physical geography of Woodward Avenue is not uniform, and the distribution of investment along it is not uniform, which means that if you drive Woodward from end to end today, you get a wildly variable experience, a few miles of genuine urban vitality near downtown and midtown, and then a much longer stretch of persistent vacancy and disinvestment north of that, where the block-by-block abandonment rates remain severe and the physical deterioration of unrehabbed buildings continues in real time. The revitalized downtown and the abandoned outer corridor are not separate stories. They are one story, a story about which parts of a catastrophically disinvested city are getting the resources needed for recovery and which parts are not, and that distribution, which tracks very closely with the racial geography of reinvestment patterns in American cities more broadly, is itself a subject that Detroit's civic leadership and community organizations have debated and continue debating with real urgency. There's a conversation happening in Detroit right now, among urban planners and community organizers and city officials and residents, about what a realistic vision for Woodward Avenue's recovery even looks like, and it's a more complicated and more honest conversation than the simple "Detroit is coming back" narrative that tends to dominate media coverage of the city. The question is not really whether there's energy and investment in certain parts of Detroit, because there demonstrably is. The question is whether the energy and investment that is concentrated in the downtown and midtown zones can actually spread northward along Woodward and along the residential side streets that intersect it, at a pace and at a scale that would actually stabilize the broader corridor before the physical condition of the vacant buildings deteriorates past the point where rehabilitation is feasible. Because that is a real deadline. Buildings that have been vacant for 10 years can often still be rehabilitated, expensively but feasibly, if the market conditions become favorable. Buildings that have been vacant for 30 or 40 years, subject to decades of water infiltration, freeze-thaw cycling, structural settlement, and the systematic stripping of any copper or other valuable materials by scrappers, often cannot. At some point, the math on rehabilitation permanently closes, and the only option left is demolition. And once you demolish a building that was itself an irreplaceable piece of the streetscape that gave Woodward its particular architectural character, you don't get that back. The city of Detroit has been managing this problem with the blunt instrument of the Detroit Land Bank Authority, which holds title to the enormous inventory of tax-foreclosed properties that the city has accumulated over decades of population loss and property abandonment, which runs at various estimates to tens of thousands of parcels. The land bank is supposed to be a mechanism for getting vacant properties back into productive use, but in practice, it has been a somewhat awkward institution, hampered by limited capacity, complex bureaucratic processes, and the fundamental difficulty of finding buyers willing to take on the liability and cost of rehabilitating severely distressed properties at prices that reflect those realities. The Michigan state government has also at various points created tax incentive programs designed to encourage investment in Detroit and other distressed Michigan communities, with results that have been genuine but uneven, concentrated in the same downtown and midtown zones that were already showing momentum rather than reaching the more distressed northern stretches of Woodward that need help most urgently. Historic preservation, which is a genuine passion for many Detroiters and a real thread of civic energy in the city, presents its own complicated calculus on Woodward. The avenue is lined with historically significant buildings, many of them individually listed on, or eligible for, the National Register of Historic Places, many of them architecturally distinctive in ways that genuinely matter to the city's cultural heritage and to its long-term identity. But historic preservation standards, which limit the kinds of physical modifications that can be made to listed properties, can also add complexity and cost to rehabilitation projects in ways that sometimes make the economics of saving a building even harder than they would be anyway. When a building is already financially marginal to rehabilitate because of the market conditions in the neighborhood, adding the additional constraints and process requirements of historic review can tip a project from barely feasible to not feasible, which is one reason that Detroit has lost some historic buildings not to outright negligence or indifference, but to the gap between preservation ideals and financial realities. This is not an argument against historic preservation. It's an acknowledgement that the tools we have for preservation were designed in conditions that assumed a functioning real estate market as the baseline, and Woodward Avenue, for most of the past 50 years, has not had a functioning real estate market in most of its length by any conventional definition of that phrase. The abandoned buildings on Woodward are also, it's worth acknowledging directly, not all the same story. Some of them are in limbo because of genuinely complicated ownership situations, title problems accumulated over decades of tax foreclosure, estate issues, unclear chains of ownership that make it legally difficult to take decisive action with the property, even when everyone involved might prefer to see it put to a productive use. Some of them are held by owners who are waiting, sometimes rationally, sometimes in denial, for market conditions that will justify rehabilitation or sale at a price that recovers something from what they spent on the property decades ago. Some of them represent genuine regulatory and bureaucratic failures in the city's management of its building stock, buildings that should have been taken through code enforcement or tax foreclosure faster than they were but weren't, for reasons having to do with the city's limited administrative capacity during the worst years of its fiscal crisis. And some of them honestly reflect a more fundamental reality, that there is not yet a functional market for their rehabilitation in their specific locations, and that the investment in city services, transit infrastructure, neighborhood amenities, and population stability that would create that market is still being built, one decision and one project and one block at a time. The broader context of Detroit's decline and partial recovery also has to be understood in the context of the 2013 bankruptcy, which was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, and which represented, in some ways, the bottom of the crisis that had been building for decades. The bankruptcy, presided over by Judge Stephen Rhodes and managed through an emergency management process that the state of Michigan imposed on the city, was traumatic for Detroit in ways that are hard to overstate. It resulted in cuts to municipal pensions that retirees had been counting on. It involved difficult negotiations over the fate of the Detroit Institute of Arts collection, which some creditors wanted to monetize to pay debts, and which was eventually protected through a creative settlement involving private philanthropy. And it represented a public acknowledgement that the fiscal model Detroit had been operating under for decades was simply no longer sustainable in the absence of the population and economic base that had once made it work. But it also provided, through the restructuring of debt and the reduction of legacy obligations, a somewhat cleaner fiscal foundation for the city going forward than it had been operating on. And in the years since the bankruptcy was resolved in late 2014, the city's finances have been in measurably better shape than they were in the decade preceding it. What that means for Woodward Avenue, concretely and practically, is that the city government has more capacity now to think about strategic investments along the corridor than it did during the worst years of the fiscal crisis. The Q-Line streetcar, which opened in 2017 and runs along a 3.3-mile stretch of Woodward from downtown through the New Center area, is the most visible infrastructure investment along the corridor in recent decades, though its effectiveness as an economic development catalyst has been the subject of genuine debate, since it operates in a city where the majority of residents travel primarily by car due to the inadequacy of the overall transit system, and its ridership has been substantially below initial projections. The Detroit People Mover, the elevated monorail system that circulates through the downtown core, similarly represents a major infrastructure investment that hasn't fully realized its development potential because it operates as an isolated system rather than as part of a broader integrated transit network. The regional transit question, specifically whether the Detroit metropolitan area will ever build the kind of comprehensive public transit system that connects the city to its suburbs in ways that make transit-oriented development viable at meaningful scale, remains one of the most consequential and most contested issues in the region's civic life.